Welcome to the Academic Womxn Amplified podcast. I'm your host, Kathy Mazak, tenured full professor, mom of three, and firm believer that the culture of academia needs to change radically. Women are revolutionizing academia within institutions that were not built for us. If you're ready to reject the culture of overwork, kick guilt and overwhelm to the curb, and amplify your voice to make a real impact on your field without breaking down or burning out, you're in the right place. In the summer season of the podcast, we're busting the myth of the quote-unquote traditional path through academia by featuring the life stories of diverse academic women who have created success for themselves on their terms. Get ready to get inspired. Let's go. Today, we are talking to Sarah Dobson. Now, Sarah is such an interesting person. She originally started out with kind of one idea of what her major would be and what her career would be, and then became interested in public health and went to do a master's degree in public health. Now, that might seem like a very typical or quote unquote traditional path, but Sarah suffered from an illness that caused her to need multiple brain surgeries during her master's degree. So when she graduated, which she did even after the brain surgeries, when she graduated from her master's, she thought, what could I do that would be a way to impact public health that's probably not a PhD? And wait until you hear what she did. Not only did she work in a research center and help support other people doing their research on public health, but she founded a nonprofit and she founded her own company. And today, what Sarah does is she helps coach people to get NIH grants. Such important work. So as you listen to this episode, I want you to think about the ways that Sarah has created her own container or looked for different containers through which to do the science, to do the academic work that aren't a PhD and that aren't a tenure track job, but are very, very impactful and really kind of science altering moves. So we really hope you enjoy this episode, our interview with Sarah Dobson. So I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself and tell us your name, your pronouns, your field of study, and what you do now.
Sure. My name is Sarah Dobson. My pronouns are she and her. My field of study is population and public health, although I do consider myself a generalist, and we'll talk about that, I'm sure. And what I do now, I work with early career researchers, helping them get funded, mostly at the NIH, but also other health research funding agencies. So I'm sort of a grant consultant, a grant strategist, a coach, an instructor, helping people write better grant applications.
Fantastic. I'm so excited. Yay. Okay. So this summer season is really about people's trajectories through academia. So we're going to start at the beginning. So tell us a little bit about what you were like as a kid.
Well, I was a huge nerd. And I use this a lot in my teaching. There's a photo of me walking uphill with my nose in a book on a holiday in Italy. So beautiful scenery, beautiful trees, and me with my nose in a book. And that's just how I was as a kid. I was one of those kids who always, was the first hand to shoot up in class. I always volunteered to read aloud. I loved school and I loved learning. And I was so enthusiastic right from the very beginning.
Yes. So many people have answered that question the same way.
Mm-hmm.
We're in the nerd club, definitely. So when did you know that you would go to college?
In the family that I grew up in, it was just sort of expected that I would go to, so I'm Canadian, so we call it it's university. Right. That's how we talk about it. But it was always sort of an expectation, and it was never something that I ever questioned. But as I moved through high school, it got trickier for me to figure out where I wanted to go and what I wanted to do, because I had this, I loved English and literature and reading, but I also loved biology, and I couldn't figure out which direction I wanted to go in. And it was really eating away at me through my last couple of years in high school.
Yeah. So what did you decide and how did you come to that decision about where to go to uni?
So it was a guidance counselor of mine. I went to boarding school, and that's a whole other story, but it was a guidance counselor of mine who brought to me this liberal arts program at a Canadian university outside of Toronto, McMaster University.
Mm-hmm.
It was called the Arts and Science program. And it was a way for me to do biology and English and, get a little bit of everything and get a really sort of generalized education in sciences and in the arts. And it was a really tiny program. They only accepted 60 students per year. And I just thought, yes, this is exactly where I want to be. And once I found out about that program, I applied to a bunch of other places, but I knew if that's where I got in, 100%, that was where I was going.
So how was that program for you? Like, do you feel like it was as wonderful as your expectations were?
It was even more than I expected. For me, it was a community of nerds that I spent 4 years with, but it wasn't just my classmates in my year. The entire program, we all kind of knew each other and, just had this community of students from, first year to fourth year in this program, really doing some interesting work and learning how to become better citizens, better humans, and just follow our own interests academically. Yeah, it was great.
That's amazing. So what did you do? Like, how did you know you might go to grad school? Did you take some time out first? Did you go straight through?
As I was going through my undergrad, I really thought that I wanted to go into medicine. But the further I got along in my undergraduate degree, I was taking all sorts of courses in political science and some really kind of out there courses. And I realized that I probably it probably wasn't going to be the best fit for me. And so as I got closer to graduating, I really started to panic because I didn't know what I wanted to do, where I wanted to go again. And I ended up deciding to go to law school.
Oh, wow.
Which it was because I didn't know what I wanted to do, and I didn't feel like I could just take time off to figure it out. And in my mind, as in my early 20s, I figured that having a law degree would open up a lot of doors for me, and it would give me a lot of different directions to move into. And that just seemed like the best possible option for me. But I was also sort of trying to sabotage myself because I only applied to one law program. It was a very prestigious program. It taught both the civil law system and the common law system in a really sort of interdisciplinary way. And I thought, there's no way I'm going to get in. I'm just going to apply to this one place. And if I don't get in, then I'll really have to figure out what I want to do. But I did get in. And so that was kind of the course I took. But I didn't want to be a lawyer. I knew it on the first day that I was there. And I lasted 3 semesters before I quit. So that was my detour into and out of law school.
What was that like to decide to quit something?
It was really difficult for me, but it is one of the most valuable learning experiences I've ever had. And I'm extremely grateful that my life took that direction. I really thought that if I quit law, that I would never get into another graduate like that was the end of my academic career. I would never be accepted anywhere again. I would never work again. I'd be disowned by my family. I mean, every possible nightmare scenario was going through my brain, trying to convince me to not quit. But in the end, it was such a relief. It was such a weight off my shoulders to recognize that this was not the path for me. And I had a moment after my first year of law classes in those days they ranked all the students by, student number, and they had it available for you to go and check. And I had assumed, because I really wasn't into this program at all, and I was really, suffering emotionally, that I was somewhere in the bottom of the law school class, and that was a reason not to quit, because I didn't want it to seem like I couldn't hack it. But I went and checked after the first year, and I was just outside the top 10% of my class. And for me, and this I think was a turning point for me, was the moment where, I found out what my rank was, and this little voice inside me said, if you can do that well at something that you don't care about, imagine what you could do if you found something that you really loved. And I don't know where that came from, but it was just this little voice inside me. And I thought, okay, I can quit. I don't care if anybody else knows about this part. I can do this and find something that's better for me. And so I lasted one more semester, so I wasn't burning any bridges, and that was it.
Well, thank goodness for that little voice. That was a really smart little voice.
It was. Yeah. My little, I don't know, how old was I then? I was like 20, 23, 22, 23.
Yeah. Amazing.
Yeah.
So how did you negotiate? Okay. So we're done with this. I got to find my thing, because I know I can do what I put my mind to. How did you find the thing? Like, what was that like?
So it actually started when I was in undergrad. I spent a summer, I got a summer job working at a community health center in North Hamilton. And that community had a lot of new immigrants to the area. It was a lower income neighborhood. And this community health center was sort of a hub for a lot of health and community services in the neighborhood. And I remember it must have been when I went in for my very first interview, there were these posters on the wall that said, education is a determinant of health. Racism is a determinant of health. Poverty is a determinant of health. And for me, it was like mind blown. I guess I would have been 20 at that point, and I'd never heard of social determinants of health before. And for me, that was also a turning point to realize, like, this is something that I'm interested in. It's something I want to do. And actually the law school detour was part of that. I thought, maybe I could do health policy kind of stuff, or I wasn't really sure, but I had it in my mind that this was something that I really cared about a lot. And so after I quit law school, I ended up working in a hospital in Montreal. That's where I was living at the time, and getting involved with a research group doing work in lung cancer patients, looking at their quality of life and learning more about the research that they were doing, and just learning more about the process and the structure of some of the research that they were doing really got me thinking about going back to grad school and doing a master's in public and population health. And that's exactly what I did. So I stayed in Montreal, and I applied to the University of Montreal to do my master's there. And that was the path back into academia after, maybe 18 months of just working and figuring things out.
Yeah. Those periods in between, right, are so formative in like culling away, right? Like this is where I'm headed. This is what I really don't want to do. I just think that there's so much to be said or I just want to validate that not going straight through is a valid way to do academia. I feel like there's this like pressure to just keep going straight through. And those detours that are not really detours, right, are just so fruitful in terms of how you then get into the scholarship next.
Well, that's exactly right. And that's one of the things that, with a bit of perspective, I've been able to look back on and say everything that I've done has led me somewhere interesting, has led me to where I am now. But it's really hard when you're in it, when you're feeling insecure about leaving and what's going to happen, and, detours along your track record, what's going to happen. But taking that time away and really reflecting on what's important to you, what matters to you, what excites you is so, so, so important.
Yeah. Okay. So you start your master's. What was grad school like for you?
Grad school was both challenging and amazing. So my master's degree was in my second language. So the University of Montreal had they called it passive bilingualism. So the courses were all taught in French, but you could, submit assignments and write your exams and your dissertation in English. So that's what I did. But it was really, really hard in that first year of coursework to try to learn everything in my second language. There were a lot of tears, a lot of frustration, but it was really gratifying to be getting that foundation in those concepts and that scholarship that I was so interested in, years before. So that was great. And then when I was just about to start my thesis, after my first year of coursework, I ended up getting really, really sick. And that derailed things for me. I ended up having to have 3 brain surgeries over the course of 3 months to address a very dangerous. I had elevated intracranial pressure. So pressure was building up in my brain and they didn't know why it was happening, but if they didn't fix it, I would have probably died. So after my first year of coursework, I had my first 2 surgeries in July and then another one in November. And then I took a pretty serious chunk of time off to just heal and recover. And I don't think I got back to my thesis until probably March of 2008.
So what was that like in terms of talking to your professors and saying like, hey, major health thing, professors of health. Now how was that? Because I think a lot of times, obviously your case is was very pressing and timely and whatever. But I think that grad students are sometimes afraid to be sick. They're afraid because of what other people are going to think or how they're going to be able to get back on. So what was it like to negotiate this major, scary health crisis in the middle of a master's program?
Well, I was definitely afraid to be sick. And it was kind of out of my hands. There was nothing I could do. I had to just take a break and relax in the immediate periods following my surgery. But I had a lot of anxiety about getting back to it and making sure that I finished on time. And I remember a friend of mine pulling me aside and just saying, you can take a break, you can just time out on this master's degree and recover from these serious brain surgeries that you've just had. It's okay. You don't need to dive right back in. And it wasn't until she said that I was like, oh yeah, I guess I can just, take some time and rest and recover. But yeah, I definitely was feeling a lot of anxiety about putting things off and leaving things behind and then extending this degree, much longer than I wanted to. I mean, in part because of tuition, in part because I had a graduate award that was going to run out and all these things. Just, I really felt that pressure. But my advisor and the other professors in the program were really supportive. They just said, look, take the time that you need. You can get back to it when you're ready. Just let us know.
Wow, that's great. I mean, it's good to have those supportive advisors and people who can really kind of give you that permission, because I do feel it's we need, again, it kind of goes back to the nerdy overachiever thing, right? It's no, I got to keep going. Brain surgery,
No, I know. Well, and I can't remember where I heard this, but I think it might've been in a Harvard Business Review article or something, but describing not just nerdy overachievers, but insecure overachievers. And I really, that was a gut punch, but it's really true. It was really true for me, just feeling I needed to prove something to myself and to everybody around me that I was smart, that I could do it, that there was something about needing to accomplish and needing to hit that next level always, because there was something inside me that I was trying to feed.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, it must have been such a difficult time as a very young person still, because you were still very young when you went through that.
I was 26, I think, when I had my first surgery. Yeah.
Wow. So you decided to go back and finish the master's. How did it go? After having life-altering surgery, right? A life-altering health experience.
I mean, this is so wild to me, but I ended up submitting my thesis on time. Like it was a 2-year master's program, and I submitted at the end of August within the 2-year period, which is just, I remember those last couple of months just writing in a super hot apartment in Montreal, just trying to get it done. But I think when I was finally ready to get back to it, I was just so motivated for it to be over. I'd been through so much in my personal life, especially, that I was just like, I'm done. I just want this to be over. I want to get out of here. I'm going to do whatever it takes to just like submit the thing and be done with it. And so that's what I did.
Wow. And so what was next for you? Like what happened? You got the master's and then what?
I submitted my master's degree, my thesis, and I immediately moved across the country to Vancouver, which is where I live now. And at that point, I just wanted to find some stability. I definitely had aspirations to go on and do a doctorate, but that kind of went out the window when I got sick. And I just really wanted a steady job with a steady paycheck and some benefits. I mean, in Canada, we, health is covered, but, you get extra health benefits and pension and that sort of thing in a job that definitely help. And I just needed to take a breath. And so I moved across the country and found a job at the University of British Columbia. There was a new research center starting up that was focused on health professions education. So how we educate health professionals to become, quality health professionals in the system. And I mean, I'd never heard of this as a field before, but it was just starting up in the Faculty of Medicine out here in Vancouver. And I came on board as the research manager and ended up staying in that research center for 5 years, I think. And I did actually get to do, over time, I did get to do some of my own research within the center, which was really exciting for me and gratifying too, that I didn't have to leave all of my academic aspirations behind when I decided to just get a job.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it sounds like what you did was like in line with everything that you had been building towards.
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So then what happened? Yeah.
So I worked at the Center for Health Education Scholarship for 5 years, I think. And partway through, as I was managing different research teams and growing the research center, I started having regular conversations with the director of research at this center, just about how my training in public and population health kind of intersected with what was happening in the medical education field, because I was noticing that there were educational psychologists and a lot of other scholars within this field, but not a lot of public health folks. And so we just started, I would just go into his office and we just sit and chat. And we ended up sort of coming up with a really interesting series of projects that became kind of my program of research around how we teach trainees, medical residents, and medical undergrads to be better health advocates for their patients. It's one of the competencies that's required when you're going through your medical residency. You need to be competent as a health advocate, but nobody really knew what that meant. And so the teaching around it was really not very good. And so we wrote a paper that kind of theorized what the problem was. And then we ended up doing some studies to try to understand it better. And it was really, really exciting to be a part of that. And that research ended up becoming part of the medical undergrad curriculum update at UBC. And it eventually made its way into the update of the CanMeds rules. So the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Canada publishes an educational framework for medical residents that's used not only in medical schools across Canada, but around the world. And so some of our research on the health advocate role got included in that update to, change the way that we teach medical residents. And that was really, really exciting.
Yeah. I mean, how impactful, right? Having really that, taking something that could be kind of theoretical, operationalizing it and having it spread around so that other people can learn from it. That's amazing. We all wish that our work had much impact,
so the point, I guess the point for the listeners is it doesn't always need to look like you think it's going to look. Like I was a research manager and grant facilitator in this research center. And I am so grateful that the faculty who worked in that center gave me the opportunity to do that work and didn't just, relegate me to all of the administrative side of things. But that an academic career doesn't necessarily have to be in the traditional sense that we think of it. You can still do really cool stuff.
Yeah.
In a way that you wouldn't necessarily think you could.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a fantastic takeaway. So yeah. So what was next for you? Like, how did you get into really being an entrepreneur, which is what you're doing now? I don't want to skip over stuff. So
No. So I worked at that research center for a period of time, and then I moved. It just felt like it was time to go. So I moved over to another research center in the School of Nursing at UBC that was focused on the health outcomes for stigmatized and vulnerable youth, particularly LGBTQ youth. And we did some really cool work there as well. But part of the reason that I had moved over to that research center was because I had started a nonprofit with some friends of mine. I co-founded a nonprofit called Basics for Health, and it was to support people to be connected with the resources they need to be healthy. So people in low-income communities who didn't necessarily have access to resources in the community or were having trouble accessing those resources, we had a nonprofit that would help connect them with some of those to make life a little bit easier for them. And what I was doing initially was kind of running the organization. I couldn't do that with a full-time job. So I moved over to this other research center to be able to at least run the nonprofit part-time.
Yeah.
But what happened was, as soon as I started, working for myself one day a week, where kind of I was in charge of my own schedule and booking my own meetings and that kind of thing, I thought, ooh, I don't want to have to go into an office. I don't want to have to work for anybody else. I really like being my own boss. And so what eventually happened was I left my very cushy, very stable position at the university to run my own business. And I stayed on for a period of time as running the nonprofit. But I eventually realized that to be able to make a living, I would have to build up my own consultancy, basically. And that's how I came to be doing what I'm doing now, which is focusing more specifically on grant writing.
So I just want to for the listeners who are paying attention to this summer season, one of the recurring themes and this is happening inside of my coaching programs too, is this kind of realization, or I just want to emphasize this idea that you are you and that the container through which you work is not you, so I think a lot of academics feel like the only way that they're going to be able to fully realize their work in the world is through the container that is the university, or that is, or something, maybe if not the university, okay, the CDC or some other institution, big institution. But I think your story is such a good example of how you can have kind of your inner purpose and things that you're interested in making an impact on. And then you can find all kinds of different containers through which to do that.
Exactly. Yeah. And I remember the moment that we got the keys to our office at the nonprofit. And I just had this hit of that 20-year-old girl who saw those posters, up in the community's health center in North Hamilton saying, this is what I want to do. And I realized that I had done it. And it wasn't at all. I mean, never in a million years would I have expected that I would have gone to law school and dropped out and had 5 brain surgeries in 8 years and all this stuff. But there it was in that moment. I had done some little germ of an idea had sprouted, and everything that I had done up to that point had been an important part of that.
Yeah, 100%. That's amazing. So what happened to the nonprofit? Did you develop the nonprofit? How did that go?
So it's still running. It's still operating. I have stepped away as the director because I needed to focus on building my business and getting that all set up. But yeah, it's still operating in British Columbia and is doing some really cool work. Yeah.
That's amazing. So talk to me a little bit about kind of your business and how, because you have an interesting business because it's like what some people call like academic adjacent, right? So it's like supportive of academics. So talk to me a little bit about it and then maybe connect it to the posters,
Sure. Yeah. Well, it definitely still is connected to those. So what I do now is I work primarily with early career researchers who are applying to the NIH, usually for the big research project grants, the R01s, but also for the Career Development Award. And what I do is really help them make their grants more compelling, more persuasive, and more exciting to the reviewers, because that's one of the things, and I noticed this when I was working in universities, was nobody teaches you how to do this. Like, I certainly didn't get it when I was in graduate school. And it's such a vital skill for academics. And it breaks my heart that nobody gets this training, that you're expected to basically, pay your own salary and the salary of everybody who works in your lab. And you're just told, like, good luck to you, figure it out.
Right.
And it's a skill set that can definitely be learned. I mean, it definitely improves with practice. Anybody who's written a series of grants knows that, but there are ways to make the process easier and faster and more efficient. And that is what I teach people. And when I work with clients one-on-one, I sort of do it for them. So they'll send me in a draft and I will tell them, move this around, do it this way, say this differently, and get their grant into more competitive shape. And I work with PIs across a variety of fields. And so what I know, based on my experience and my track record with these grants, is that the framework works. Like, it doesn't matter if you're a neuroscientist or an epidemiologist, like, the rhetorical strategies work. Yeah. And that's really gratifying.
So I think one of the things, like, I talk a lot about, I always use air quotes, the culture of academia.
Yeah.
Like, and when I say that, I mean like that, like the bad culture, like the like monolithic, like we're all gonna, like, this is the way, like that very unhealthy parts. And I think one of the things inside of the culture of academia is this, like, kind of like putting on the pedestal of the idea. Like, we have an idea and our idea should be funded, without thinking about, like, the way that you present that idea to people and make it meaningful for other people who aren't you is like, that's exactly what you're talking about, right? It's like, that is the skill. The idea cannot stand by itself, or we can't expect funders to just like sweep in and say, pluck this idea. You have to present it in a certain way.
No. And so what I tell people is that your idea is just what gets you in the door. That's what gets your grant discussed. It's not what gets you funded. And I think, and this I'm sure will resonate with your audience, Kathy, but prioritizing the idea is part of the patriarchal setup of academia, right? It's the great men of science. It's your reputation. It's all of those insidious evil parts of academia that are being privileged. And what I teach is that you need to think about your reviewer. Writing is an act of empathy. You need to put yourself in your reviewer's shoes, think about what they need, the information that they need to make a judgment about not only the quality of your idea, but the feasibility of your project, the quality of the team that you have around you to be able to execute, and of course, the significance and the impact, the worthiness of your project. So all of that matters, not just the idea part. But what I have noticed in my work over the years is that that's what people focus on. Of course it is, because that's what they're taught to focus on is, really getting down in the weeds with your approaches and methods. But that is not how you get your grant funded. That is only a part of it. And one of my missions is to get people to understand that it's about making that connection and understanding what your reviewer needs from you.
Yeah, that's so powerful. And then, amazing. So let's just dive with 2 feet into kind of the current moment. So we're recording this on the 9th of June.
Yes.
And I talked to another person who is also now academic adjacent and in Canada and in public health, kind of And one of the things that I said, and I'm not saying anything new or that's not my idea, was how COVID and then the murder of George Floyd kind of magnified this connection between racism and public health. So I wonder if you could talk like a little bit about that from your perspective in the world, and how being better writers of grants might help to chip at some of those, inequities.
Sure. So, one of the foundational concepts that I learned in my population health training was how to think in terms of systems and structures, and how those systems and structures can enact violence on people. And I mean, in the case of population health, how it can affect their health outcomes. And that is work that I brought into my, medical education, health advocacy stuff. It was definitely part of what I did at the Stigma and Resilience Among Vulnerable Youth Center, and LGBTQ youth outcomes. And in this moment, it's so clear that what is going on with COVID is disproportionately affecting Black communities and communities of color. And it's because of the systems and structures that enact violence on those communities every day, right? And that can be, for sure, a hard pill to swallow for some people. And there's a lot of, there was a lot of talk in the early days about COVID disproportionately affecting these communities. And a lot of people were speculating like, oh, it's to do with genetics and it's to do with all of these like individual factors. But that's not what it is. It's because of racism. It's because of these systems that are oppressing communities and also individuals. And so, so that is something that is definitely adding to the uprising of the current moment. And certainly, and those systems and structures, of course, exist in academia as well, right? I mean, we talked about, paternalism. and patriarchal systems within universities, but also I work a lot with the NIH, the National Institutes of Health. And there have been some studies over the last 10 or so years that show that Black scientists are funded, irrespective of all sorts of other factors, are funded at lower rates than other groups. And again, that is a structural issue that must be addressed. And there have been some investigations into that, some follow-up studies around why might that be. And one of the studies that came out talked about topic choice. And part of the reason that Black scientists are not funded at the same rate as white scientists is because the topics are, quote unquote, I'm using air quotes now, less important than, which is, I mean, it's crap, right? That is not, that is another example of structural inequities. This assumption that those topics that are of interest to Black scientists are not of interest more generally to science in America. So the work that I do, I work with individual scientists, individual researchers to get their work funded and to give them a leg up so that their work can stand out and that they can get funded. But there's definitely still work that needs to be done within the structures in academia and in the funding institutions to address these inequities. And that is where, I mean, those conversations are definitely happening more now because of what's happening in the world and this tipping point. And I'm really optimistic that things will start changing.
I mean, I think it's a conversation in academia that we're constantly fighting, and I'm not even saying the patriarchy anymore. I'm just saying the racist patriarchy. Because I don't think you can unhook, intersectional feminists have taught us, right? That you can't unhook those things. And so everyone needs to be thinking about unpacking how they decide what work is important. And we've been talking in our I Should Be Writing Facebook group about Cite Black Women, which you can, go to. There's a hashtag that's hashtag Cite Black Women. And there's an organization that's called citeblackwomen.org, citeblackwomenscholars.org. And we'll link it up in the show notes. But it feels really uphill, but it's so necessary. We can't have NIH or anybody saying this is what's important and this is not what's important, but they do it every day with their dollars. And so we need to figure out how, as academics, we can push against those things.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that can happen within institutions on committees. It can happen within study sections at the NIH, but it can also happen politically. Like the way that the NIH works is that individual institutes are funded with taxpayer dollars. So what gets funded and the missions and the priorities of those individual institutes can be influenced politically, and that is part of the work that needs to be done as well. So yes, absolutely, this work needs to be done within the ivory tower, but it also can happen in the political structures that fund these large organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. So this has been really interesting. Okay. So if you wanted to kind of say to young people, I think another thing that this just reminds me of, I guess, is that I think there's a difference between this new generation of scholars coming up and the idea of this kind of traditional path, quote unquote, through academia. I am seeing with our most, and I know that you work a lot with early career scholars as well, but I'm seeing like the earliest career, the people who are on like year 1 or 2 of the tenure track, being like so much more open to jumping out of academia completely than people who are like of like my generation in academia. That there's this kind of like idea that, has broken down a lot because nobody has a job for 30 years anymore, So what would you say to like young people who are interested in public health, who are interested in these ideas that you've been talking about in terms of, should they go get a master's degree or a PhD? Like, what are the different kind of options that are available to them?
Oh, this could go in so many different directions.
I know, right? Sorry.
Yeah. So, there are so many different ways for you to make a difference, to have an influence. And I think one of the most important things to do is to do a lot of self-reflection around why you are pursuing an academic career. For me, the decision not to pursue a PhD was in part because of circumstance and needing that stability and recognizing that I definitely wouldn't have that if I pursued a PhD. But there was a lot of anxiety around not going in that direction because, nobody would think that I'm smart. And that really mattered to me a lot. Yeah. And I had to do a lot of self-reflection around like, why does it matter to me so much that people think that I am smart? Like, why can't I just do what interests me and follow my own path? So I think a lot of it is that sort of insecure overachiever piece around needing those accolades and needing that recognition, and just being as honest as you possibly can with yourself around why you're doing what you're doing. Yeah. Because there are ways to do what you love that don't involve getting a PhD or, going onto the tenure track. There are lots of different opportunities to do what you love and to make a difference.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Yes. So tell us a little bit about how to find you. If somebody's listening, they're like, I need some of that for my career grant or my R01. How can people find you and how do you work with people?
Sure. So you can find me at my website at saradobson.co. And I actually made a little freebie for your listeners. Yes. If you are writing a grant anytime soon, you can go to saradobson.co/amplified and download a workbook that will help you map out and pace your next grant application. So hopefully that will be super helpful to you, especially in these times where there are a lot of added distractions and challenges when it comes to writing grants. Yeah, this little workbook will get you started. Fantastic. And so some of the work that I do with PIs is I'll work with them one-on-one. I call it a strategic review. And so I work with them to improve the clarity and the persuasiveness of their applications. But I also have a grant writing course for folks who are writing R01s to the NIH. If you join my mailing list, then you'll get lots of information about signing up for that course if you are interested in doing that.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Sarah. What a fantastic story. It really makes me think about the container and about the many, many ways that we can be effective and pursue what we really want inside and make big change in the world. So thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Well, thanks for having me, Kathy. That was great.
Thank you for spending your valuable time investing in yourself and your career by listening to this episode. If you'd like to continue the conversation, join the over 13,000 academic women and non-men folks in the I Should Be Writing Facebook group. Just go to facebook.com/groups/I Should Be Writing or search for I Should Be Writing inside your Facebook app. See you inside.